Welcome to our presentation, Creating Digital Libraries that People with Disabilities Can Use. Why talking about compatibility with assistive technologies is necessary. My name is Daniella Levy-Pinto, and I'm a project coordinator with NNELS, the National Network for Equitable Library Service in Canada. I lead a team of accessibility testers, people with lived experience of print disability who assess the accessibility of ebooks and reading applications to access content through public libraries across Canada, and provide recommendations for eliminating and preventing accessibility barriers. I am totally blind and have been a user of assistive technologies for over 2 decades in my previous, all my roles in academic and professional settings. And I work to support a paradigm change to born accessible publishing and inclusive design in digital spaces. I am in Toronto.
My name is Mark Weiler. I'm a librarian from Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. Currently, I am a co-chair of the Advocacy and Education subgroup within the DLF's Accessibility Working Group. I'm also the facilitator of the Canadian Association of Professional Academic Librarians Web Content Accessibility Guidelines Community of Practice. I've hosted national, provincial, and international reading groups that studied these guidelines closely. I recently passed the JAWS certification exam and I'm learning sightless navigation with JAWS right now.
What is NNELS? NNELS, National Network for Equitable Library Service, provides accessible books for people with print disabilities in Canada. We have a repository of accessible content, this is because Section 32 in the Canadian Copyright Act, the exception allows us to make this content for people with print disabilities, and the books are available through public libraries across Canada. The service began in 2014 and has been growing ever since. NNELS also advocates for an accessible and equitable reading landscape and to advance the agenda of born accessible publishing. And NNELS also hires people with print disabilities to build capacity. We have done research because NNELS recognizes that people with print disabilities are really the experts in non-traditional ways of reading, and they can make significant contributions in this area. We conducted a study, the How Do You Read study, through a national survey and focus groups looking at the reading needs, preferences, and habits of people with print disabilities in Canada, all across the country, and collected input of over 600 Canadians. Most of the participants identified the need for more accessible content. Only 10% of participants reported that it was very easy for them to find content, accessible content. So there's a major need for more content following accessibility standards. This work was done as part of a broader study looking at a sustainable initiative for accessible publishing in Canada. Answers to the survey and focus groups about preferred formats, comfort, and knowledge about different technologies, and also demographic information provided valuable insights that will help the publishing and library communities to better serve people with print disabilities in Canada. And we found that even if there is accessible content, it is difficult for people to access it. Also, there's a growing awareness that people with the number of people with print disabilities is larger than initially thought. So there's the need to do more research in this area and really understand what the needs are for this specific segment of people with print disabilities. Also, for many Canadians with print disabilities, it is difficult for them to learn how to use technologies and to pay for these technologies. Programs to subsidize assistive technologies are not equal in Canada. There are some provinces that don't have them. And also libraries, we found that libraries are a vital and well-used resource for people with print disabilities. The vast majority of participants in the study obtain their books through their public libraries or also from organizations providing material for people with print disabilities, such as NELS or CLIR, which is the other Canadian organization.
So I'm going to pick up on a point that Daniella mentioned, and that's about assistive technologies. But what are assistive technologies? Well, readers with print disabilities often use specialized software or hardware that make it possible to interact with computers and mobile devices. Examples of assistive technologies include switches, voice controls, screen readers, screen magnification software, and refreshable braille displays. A major type of assistive technologies are screen readers. These are programs that run on computers, tablets, or smartphones, and they read aloud information about the app being displayed, which lets a blind person interact with them. Another type of assistive technology is the braille display, and this is a hardware device that attaches to a computer or mobile device. They can convert information about the interface into braille in real time, and they contain rows of pins which are raised to present braille encodings that can be read by touch. And this slide is a picture of a 40-cell braille display.
Now, moving on to accessible library experiences. What does accessibility look like? An accessible library experience for someone to be able to access audiobooks or ebooks, three things need to happen. One, content must be designed following accessibility standards. So ebooks need to be accessible. Two, an accessible platform or interface from which to find and borrow that accessible content. And three, an accessible way to consume that content. When all features in library websites or reading applications are accessible, they allow people to search the catalog and browse, create an account, find and download content. And when this is possible is because the applications and websites are following accessibility standards.
So I want to pick up on the topic of accessibility standards by raising the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, in particular 2.0, but there's a new version 2.1. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are internationally adopted guidelines to help organizations remember to make or buy web content that has features needed by people with disabilities. Organizations around the world, including galleries, libraries, archives, museums, and universities, are required to buy or develop web content that follows these guidelines. WCAG has 5 conformance requirements, and the first 3 has organizations focusing on the features of the interface itself, and Daniella will describe some issues screen reader users often find in the web experience.
So the most common issues that we find are unlabeled or incorrectly labeled buttons or websites. So if there's no text, the screen reader cannot interpret the icon, or if the link has a name doesn't make sense, we don't really know what the button will do, or where the link will take us. So this is an issue. The second issue is when websites or applications are cluttered, this is because they don't have headings, for example, or landmarks, and this makes it very difficult for orientation and to find different sections of the app or content. And the third issue is when controls or menus cannot really be accessed or they don't work with the keyboard or swipe gestures, when the only way of activating them is with a mouse.
So while these are problems of the interface, the fourth WCAG requirement, which is the main topic of this presentation, requires web content to be compatible with the assistive technologies that people use. Why is this important? If your web content does not work with the assistive technology people rely on, can you really say the web content is accessible to these people? So this presents a challenge. The authors of WCAG wrote a lengthy section that describes the challenging parts of this requirement. Organizations need to know what assistive technologies are used in our communities. And community members may use older assistive technologies because they can be expensive and difficult to learn. And related to this, people with disabilities may not be able to buy the latest technology because of barriers from entering the workforce. Additionally, developers also need to know which coding techniques actually work with these particular assistive technologies. So who is responsible for this? Now, unable to answer this difficult question, the authors of WCAG gave the responsibility to us. They wrote, quote, "The working group defers judgment of how much, how many, or which assistive technologies must support a technology to the community and to entities closer to each situations that sets requirements for an organization," end quote. So what is the solution? The authors did make a suggested solution. They wrote, quote, "There is a need for an external and international dialogue on this topic," end quote. And they also wrote, "The working group encourages more discussions of this topic in the general forum of society, since the lack of generally available yet robust assistive technologies is a problem that affects users, technology developers, and authors negatively," end quote. Expanding this conversation, therefore, is important. So we need to raise and expand this conversation about the state of assistive technologies with leaders in our organizations, in the halls of Congress, and on Parliament Hill in Ottawa. For example, those of us in Canada can ask Employment and Social Development Canada how its new accessibility data and measurement strategy recognizes the essential need to know what assistive technologies Canadians are relying on.
The Canadian society recognizes the right to accessibility through human rights laws, as well as federal and provincial legislation about accessibility. But these are difficult to enforce and time-consuming. So accessibility must be simplified and enhanced by having conversations. Also, government subsidies should work for everyone, and they should be comparable all across Canada. All provinces need them. In 2018, NAILS published a study on the availability of Braille and made a recommendation for government funding to support the purchase of thousands of Braille displays so that blind people can access content. This is essential for literacy. Library users also need to know how to access the service. And this is really a complex requirement that requires dialogue. We need to have these conversations to ensure that people with print disabilities can participate in the web.
So some practical steps that we can each take. While this is a complex problem that libraries, galleries, museums, or archives can't solve alone, it does not mean we can abandon our individual responsibility. We have ample opportunities to make significant progress by asking two simple questions. First, what are the assistive technologies that people in our communities are using? If we repeat this question, new ideas will inevitably come and will make progress. So for example, could universities survey school boards to ask what assistive technologies high school students are using?
And second, ask vendors and developers if the content and their applications and websites work with these technologies. By asking these questions in different contexts, the questions will evolve. For example, ask library procurement officers if they are asking this from vendors. And this is essential because otherwise people with disabilities are excluded from information. Access to information is essential to exercise democratic rights, which is essential in a democratic society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.